Hey guys, welcome to That Florida Feeling. I hope everybody's having a good week. Thank you for everybody who reached out for well wishes. I wasn't feeling well. Still not 1,000%. I would dare say I'm 75%, but I'm better. So thank you for reaching out. I really appreciate all the well wishes. You guys are so nice. Thanks to everybody who also interacted with the Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok pages. You guys are awesome. It still amazes me that you guys want to hear so much about Florida. Thanks if you participated in the poll. I know I was a little bit late. Part of being under the weather is I still don't know what day it is. I just remembered it was Friday. Though, very early good morning to you guys as I do this podcast. Sorry again if I don't sound correct. I'm still getting over a couple different things. I know that we do a lot of fun places in Florida, and there are a lot of fun places in Florida, and we talk about different cities, and we talk about history and ghost, and today I want to talk about some of the earliest Florida history. Actually, it's more the earliest U.S. history. Did you know that Florida actually played an important role in the American Revolutionary War? I didn't even realize this was a thing till I was trying to figure out topics, and I was like, did they fight battles here? And went down a rabbit hole, and yes, they did. Florida actually played an important part and even had battles fought here. Now, I know that most people just think about the original 13 colonies in the early U.S. history, but two more actually existed. The 14th and 15th colonies were East Florida and West Florida. So Florida actually played a very important part in the American Revolutionary War. So we do know that the Spanish came and founded Florida, and St. Augustine was founded in 1565. Therefore, it predates U.S. history by, I would dare say, close to 200 years. Because the American Revolutionary War was in the 1770s. So, Florida did play an important part, and it was around for all this, and it's just another addition to Florida's history. So, St. Augustine was already established, like I said, as an active city for actually way more than 40 years before even Jamestown was established. Jamestown was established in Virginia in 1607, and like I said, St. Augustine had been since 1565. Now, the Spain had obviously already explored this area, starting in 1513, and given it the name Florida before the British had even crossed the ocean. And the Spanish had maintained control of it, establishing cities and missions before the British even took control of the Florida territory in 1763. So remember, the British came over, founded the colonies, and then Florida was already established by Spain, and then Britain got control of Florida in 1763. And that's actually what led to the separation of East and West Florida. British separated the areas. East Florida was St. Augustine as its capital, and West Florida with Pensacola being its capital. Now, British rule meant that East Florida, which was the modern boundary of the state, and basically the boundary, by the way, of the East and West state was Apalachicola. So that's where the boundary was between East and West Florida, and with British rule, it kind of meant that East Florida and West Florida kind of became their own colonies. Of course, West Florida was anything west of Apalachicola, the Panhandle, parts of what today are Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and that was kind of its own colony. And then, of course, East Florida was anything to the east of the river and down, and that was technically another colony. So much like their own entities of the other 13 colonies, each colony acted with its own governor and had its own rule. So, technically, there were 15 colonies. Now, we know that on August 11th, 1776, when the news of the Declaration of Independence was signed, or it was signed in 1776, it did not reach the Florida colonies until August. And when it actually reached St. Augustine, they got upset. They actually got really mad because the East Colony was super loyal to the British. They were so loyal to the British that they actually created effigies of John Hancock and Sam Adams and hung them in the St. Augustine Plaza, which, by the way, is still the plaza in the center of downtown today, and they burned them. The colonies were very loyal, and they didn't understand why anyone would want to break away from British rule, which is a far cry from the rest of the 13 colonies that said, we hate you, basically. So the war began in 1776, and the Florida colonies were the only two southern colonies that remained loyal to the British. Now, the problem with this was that the rest of the colonies were obviously against British rule, And that meant that getting food, clothing, and other supplies to troops in other parts of the colonies and Caribbeans meant that Florida was a very vital place. Florida was kind of that barrier between the British, what would be the U.S. colonies and the Caribbean. Now, you have to think that America had these 13 colonies, because remember, Florida didn't go with them. So America had their 13 colonies when they revolted. But Britain had 33 colonies. And that was 33 colonies that stretched from Canada all the way down to the Caribbean. So kind of had more things to worry about than just these 13 colonies, with only 2 remaining loyal. So Florida was deeply important to Britain. And the Americans knew that. They knew that this was a very specific strategic spot, because it really did stop them from getting into the Caribbean and telling other people that they needed to break away from Britain. Now, the American Revolutionary War was mainly fought in the northern colonies, but most of the British officers weren't in the northern colonies as much as you think. They were actually in the Caribbean to protect the majority of their colonies, and that's because most of these colonies were sugar production, which back then, sugar was the equivalent of oil today. It was really important to the global economy, and they knew that, and they had to protect it at all cost. Now, the Floridian colonies were located, like I said, as a boundary right between the Americans and the rest of the British colonies, and the British actually used this as an advantage, especially from St. Augustine in East Florida and, of course, Pensacola in West Florida. They used these 2 cities as major points. Now, St. Augustine remained extremely vital to the British because it was the only stone fortress south of the Chesapeake Bay. And they knew that. They knew it was a good holding point. They knew that because they had tried numerous times to attack the Castillo de San Marco when the Spanish held control of the colony. So they knew how useful and defensive it was. And they felt that it would be helpful as to stop rebelling colonists from coming south. Now, the colonies of East and West Florida kind of stopped the rebellion from spreading further south. Like I said, most of Florida did remain loyal. But also the Floridian colonies, they were a point for troops and supplies to the war. They could bring them in from the Caribbean without any troubles. And they thought that they could use the southern colonies as a point to be able to regain the rest of the colonies going from south to north to get back their American colonies. Now, the importance of all this was not lost on Americans. George Washington, in fact, actually knew and was keenly aware of the strategic importance of these colonies. He actually focused on Florida a lot, as he wrote more than 80 letters to Continental Congress expressing his concern. He also authorized 5 separate invasions into East Florida between 1776 and 1780. Now, St. Augustine wasn't the only major city that was a strategic point. Jacksonville was also an important area for the Loyalists as they fought in the war. And that's because the city was actually home to several armed encounters between the British and the American colonists. These encounters led people to be held in St. Augustine as prisoners in the Castillo, since it was a great place to hold prisoners, as they had done that before. In fact, 3 of the Declaration signers were actually held in the city of St. Augustine as prisoners. Now, Jacksonville was known as Calford. What a name, Calford. It just doesn't have the same ring as Jacksonville. Anyways, Jacksonville was known as Calford during the Revolutionary War, and it was actually important to the Timucuan tribes in the area, and that's because they would trade there. They would trade, and then they would take the King's Road, which was the road that connected Jacksonville to St. Augustine, for cattle trade. Now, if you think about it, you probably know exactly which road is the King's Road. If you've ever driven from Jacksonville to St. Augustine, you probably know. And if you don't know, if you've ever driven down 1, that is Old King's Road. And then it connects in to other parts of the city as it weaves around. Now, the treaty oak still stands in Jacksonville, and it's an 800-year-old oak that has witnessed many, many meetings between the Americans and the Indians, the British and the Indians, and every other type of natural disaster and Mother Nature's thrown at it. So this oak has actually witnessed the meeting between the British and the Indian representatives in 1775. Now remember, that's almost a whole year before the war started. And the reason they met was to negotiate a treaty. And the Indians had been helping the British to protect Florida. And They wanted to keep this treaty. They wanted their help during this impending war and then during the actual war. And they used this during the war to get any help they could to keep the colonies and the rebellion from spreading south. Now, the majority of the encounters in the war that took place in East Florida happened between Jacksonville and then what is today the Georgia state line. So think like Fernandina and that area. And Florida was mostly guarded by the British Army out of St. Augustine, but when reinforcements were called and they had to head north, leaving the colony guarded by militias known as the East Florida Rangers, other citizens who wanted to help the Rangers, and the Indian warriors that they had made pacts with. So the first battle was the Battle of Thomas Creek, or the Thomas Creek Massacre, however you want to call it. Depends on what side of history you're looking at. And this took place on May 17th, 1777. And the battle wasn't really a battle as you would think of it. It was more like an ambush. It was an ambush by the British soldiers, loyalist militia, and Indian warriors on a mounted Georgia militia. And the battle took place near the mouth of Thomas Creek in northeast Florida. And the encounter was the only actual major encounter in 2 out of the 3 attempts by the American forces to invade Florida at the beginning of the war. The Georgia colony organized an expedition against the capital of British East Florida, which is St. Augustine, and the expedition was actually in response to Thomas Brown raiding settlements in Georgia. Side note, Thomas Brown was a militiaman who liked to go and to disrupt the peace in southern Georgia. And this expedition was organized by Georgia President Button Gwinnett. He got General Robert Howell, to agree to the expedition, which gained him men from the Continental Forces and other regiments to join the expedition. He got near 300 men in total, including some militia cavalry, to join the expedition. And they left out on May 1st, out of Sunbury, and headed to St. Augustine. And they marched and rode as they waited, and they actually also had a group sail inward to meet them at Sawpit Bluff on Amelia Island. Now, the governor of East Florida, Patrick Tunyon, was alerted to the plans and learned that some of the forces had already crossed the St. Mary's River by May 10th. So they were getting close. By the way, St. Mary's River kind of creates a boundary between the 2 states. So he knew that they were getting close. So Brown had already actively been raiding near the border through this part of May and had alerted the governor that, hey, they're moving, they're on their plans. What do you want us to do? Kind of kept in touch, kind of let him know what was going on. And as Brown did these raids, he discovered Baker's camp. Now, Baker was one of the men who was moving south on this expedition. And Brown had actually sent men to ask them, hey, why are you doing this? What are you doing? And Baker's camp fired upon them. There was no friendly peace talks. They just fired upon them. So, what did Brown do? Brown sent Indians into Baker's camp on the night of May 14th to 15th to steal horses. And they were trying to steal, I think, about 15 horses. They did get some. They were fired upon in the process, and a skirmish ensued. The horses were recaptured. 1 Indian was killed in the fighting. And this Indian is kind of the part of the process that really kicked off this whole battle. Because when they found this Indian, they found him to be mutilated by British forces. And the action of killing and mutilating an Indian led to the Indians getting more upset at the colonists. Which, by the way, side note, yes, they are Native Americans. For historical, they're always, for some reason, called Indians, so that's why I'm using that term. I don't want anybody to get upset. They are Native Americans, I know. But Baker moved his camp after figuring out that they knew where he was and they were going to steal the horses again. They moved his camp knowing that East Florida forces had been alerted to the fighting, and they knew that they were going to come to him. So he moved west. He headed up and camped on the banks of Thomas Creek, which was a tributary of the Nassau River. Now, Brown's group had been reinforced by some British, and they went looking for the new camp. Now Brown, British, and more Indian warriors are hunting these people down, especially after they killed and mutilated the 1 Indian. And they found them. They found them on May 16th. Brown's Indians and Rangers set up an ambush ahead of Baker's route, while the reinforcements led by Mark Prevost advanced behind Baker. Baker was heading down the route as he ran into the ambush because they had already set up an ambush ahead of him. And when turning to flee, they ran into the reinforcements behind them. and the Patriots were easily overwhelmed by the Rangers and the Indians as they ambushed them from the underbrush. Baker fled on horseback through the swamps as other Georgians fled with him. The report states that 3 Georgians were killed, 9 wounded, and 31 captured. Most of the captured were later massacred by the vengeful Muskogee Indians because they mutilated that warrior. The Loyalists and Floridians reported absolutely no casualties. Now, the men that were supposed to meet up with Baker upriver didn't arrive until May 19th and were met by 13 of Baker's men who had fled and told them what happened. Now, the 31 captured. 3 men out of that 31 captured escaped Indian captivity and reported the massacre to Baker's men because the Indians killed most everybody that they captured. There was very few exceptions unless they fled because they were very, very upset. And they knew, so after they reported this massacre, they all knew that the Floridian governor had sent a small fleet to meet them, so they abandoned the other invasion and sailed back to Savannah. So they were figuring out it was kind of tough to come into Florida to invade. Now, the other battle that took place in Florida took place in what is called the Battle of Alligator Bridge, and it took place on June 30th, 1778. The boundary between Georgia and Florida was consistently being raided by both sides. Georgia forces thought that St. Augustine was vulnerable, and they had already tried 2 times to have an expedition to capture it. Of course, the first 2 failed, and that includes the battle we just talked about, the Battle of Thomas Creek. But, not wanting to give up, they wanted to try again. So General Howe in Georgia agreed to support another expedition in April of 1778. And this time, 400 of Georgia's Continental troops were going to move with Fort Howe as they waited for more troops to arrive from Georgia to South Carolina. They were determined to capture St. Augustine. The forces continued to grow to over 1,300 men by May, and General Howe began to lead them south on May 10th. The forces were already dealing with hot weather, rain, bad conditions, and frequent desertion. By the way, if they deserted, they were usually executed if found, and they had already had up to 11 executions by this time for desertion alone. So it was easy to say that morale was low and supplies were also low. Now, the expedition moved south and finally got to the St. Mary's River by June 26th. So they're not moving fast. In fact, they're having pretty much every trouble you can imagine just to get south into Florida. Now, the governor of East Florida was aware of the movement, and his top general, General Provost, was also aware as well. Thomas Brown from the Battle of Thomas Creek continued before the recon, and Thomas Brown's still out there raiding, the same guy from the Battle of Thomas Creek. He's still out there raiding. He's still looking for stuff. He's still messing with people. And he would actually test the security of these camps that would lead to skirmishes. So he was really just aggravating them. And General Provost began to station troops along the route into St. Augustine as he had heard that they were moving south again to try and capture St. Augustine from Thomas Brown. Now, the expedition towards St. Augustine obviously had its problems, and it finally actually broke down when 2 generals, General Howe and General Houston, could not agree on how to proceed with the attack. Houston wanted to directly march into St. Augustine and force a fight with the British forces, but Howe wanted to capture Fort Tonyan first because he felt that it was a better standing point. So Howe ordered his men to Fort Tonyan, and Houston stayed camped, and that was the first problem that they were going to have. Now, Brown was actually near Fort Tonyan, and he heard of the movements, so he actually burned and abandoned the fort and took his men into the swamps because he didn't want it to fall into the hands of General Howe. And Howe actually made it to the ruined fort and actually occupied it on June 29th. I don't know what he was occupying. It was burned to the ground. But, hey, I guess that's a win in his book. Now, just remember during all this time, this is June in Florida. So you can imagine how hot and humid and muggy and just absolutely miserable it is. So on June 30th, Howe sent 100 cavalry to locate Brown. Brown and his men had his men circle around and others hide along the route. The men Brown had sent to flank them were ambushed because they were betrayed by deserters, and most of his men were captured or killed. And Brown began to move down the road towards Alligator Bridge. Now, of course, Brown is in a tight spot because he is being chased now. Nobody likes to be chased, but he's being chased. And as he did, he moved down towards Alligator Bridge. Now, Alligator Bridge is actually 14 miles south of Fort Tonyan, and it was actually already being defended by a loyalist led by Daniel McGirth. And McGirth had about 200 men, so Brown knew that they were going towards the bridge, and that they were going to have reinforcements. But as they moved towards this bridge, they were ambushed. The ambush actually resulted in Brown and his men running into the fort, and the British had positioned by the bridge. They were running to the fort, to the bridge. They were just trying to get away from these people fighting, and as they ran, a firefight broke out. But there was confusion. There was actually confusion. No one was wearing uniforms, so the British actually started firing on Brown and his men. But the British eventually realized that Brown was under attack and started finally fighting with them against the colonists. Both sides had casualties, and the battle at Alligator Creek was the last American attempt on East Florida. So they realized that Florida was not as easy to capture as they thought, and they kind of just made note of it and gave up. Now, Florida was important to the British during the war for supplies, as I said, a barrier from the rebellion, and a place for prisoners. And prisoners from the colonies were held at the Castillo de San Marco. Christopher Gadsden from South Carolina was actually held there for 42 weeks. And if you've ever toured the Castillo de San Marco, you don't really get to go to that part of it, but you can imagine how just absolutely miserable that place had to be, with the really thick stone coquina walls, and just how absolutely dank and miserable it was. Now, the Castillo and St. Augustine were important to the British, honestly, because most of St. Augustine is where the Revolutionary War people stayed and then were sent out of, just the sheer amount of forces that were stationed in that city. And you can actually catch a glimpse of some of the history of the British in St. Augustine, especially on St. George's Street today. You can even see the governor's house that was home to the British governors that sits at the end of St. George's Street in the plaza. So basically, if you walk out dead onto St. George's Street, onto, I want to say that's King Street. It's been a while since I've roamed that part of St. Augustine. But yeah, if you go down the end of St. George's Street, you're at the road, and you're looking at a house. And then the plaza's to the left. That house is the governor's house. And you actually can go in. It's a museum. It's actually kind of cool. You can see a lot of different artifacts and hear about the history of it. But the State Arsenal was actually also in St. Augustine, and that is today the Florida National Guard. You can go over towards where the barracks are in the cemetery, and that actually dates back to Revolutionary War times. The St. Francis Barracks were actually originally a monastery that were converted into an arsenal during the British rule, which would end up being the Revolutionary War times. So St. Augustine and Florida did play a super important part in the Revolutionary War, whether you realize it or not. Now, of course, we didn't hear much about West Florida. The British kind of had other things to worry about, so Spain actually easily recaptured West Florida as of 1781, and then East Florida eventually reverted back to Spanish control as the British traded it to Spain for control of Gibraltar in 1783. Eventually, Florida would become a U.S. territory in 1821 and then formally a state in 1845. Florida's history in the U.S. and British sides of the American Revolutionary War is often overlooked because, from an American perspective, it was another part of the British territory to capture the war. But from a British side, Florida was extremely vital and only adds to the interesting history of the Sunshine State. I didn't realize that the British were so loyal. I mean, they would technically be the British at the time in Florida. They were so loyal to the crown at that time. I guess, even though I've done the part of the history of it and I've looked at it and I've read about it, I just assumed that there was still a lot of Spanish because that they had founded the city, and that the ones that stayed would have wanted to see Britain get their butts kicked because they were always fighting each other or trying to get new territories and land. So to me, it was just amazing to hear that so much of Florida was still loyal to the crown, which I guess means that when the British took over, they brought a lot of people with them, which kind of doesn't surprise me, I guess, especially from the ones that moved down south from the original British colonies. I hope that you guys enjoyed learning some of the history of the state. I just kind of wanted to write on something different today. I had no idea that the state was that important to the British during the war. I know that St. Augustine still bears the marks from the British, the Spanish, and the U.S. that have ruled over it. I hope that you found that very interesting. But you know what else that the Florida bears from over time? The marks from Florida Man. Florida Man is known to have his moments, and this week's moment is a very, very stupid one. I found this week's Florida Man from 2018, actually straight out of St. Augustine. Florida Man accused of breaking into the St. Augustine alligator farm and jumping into the crocodile pit. Yes, he did survive. I don't know how, but he did. He was bitten by one of the crocodiles, and after a stay in the hospital, he was booked for burglary and criminal mischief. He damaged property before jumping in the pit, and the staff found a pair of shorts and blood and a pair of Crocs floating in the pond the next day. Can't make that last part up. The police were alerted, and they already had him because he had gone to the hospital for a crocodile bite. I think at that point I would have said it was an alligator bite, not giving myself completely away, but it's Florida Man. Nobody said he was smart. Yeah, y'all. Staff, drugs, and alcohol. Don't turn into Florida Man. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and look into Florida's history. If you have a second to review, I would really appreciate it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow the podcast so you don't miss out on any episodes. Also, guys, if you're on Instagram or TikTok or Facebook and you use the hashtag #ThatFloridaFeeling, it shows me where you are in the Sunshine State, and I can share your beautiful pictures and stories, and other people can see just what's going on in the state. Thank you guys so much for listening this week. I'm sorry if I sound a little under the weather still. I promise I'm on the mend. Don't forget to drink water. Be nice. Hope you've started your Christmas shopping, guys. And as always, that's your daily dose of sunshine.